Well, welcome back, VITA volunteers, to the second session of the refresher courses on specialized topics. This is on behalf of the Central Arizona VITA Network, the City of Phoenix, and Masters of Coin. We've been presenting these sessions for more experienced volunteers to deal with specialized topics. These sessions have been offered live, but several of our volunteers have asked if we could record something like this because they couldn't attend the live sessions. So in our first session, we covered energy credits, but also in that first session, we also did the first half of it was on what's new for tax year 2024. So if you haven't seen that, you might want to go back and look at what's new. We're not going to repeat that in this session. Today, we're going to dive directly into education credits. And there's a lot to cover in this section right here. So let's share my screen. And so as we said, we're going to talk about education credits. Now, what we're going to talk about is we'll just give a brief, just to kind of set the stage, a brief overview of what refundable and non-refundable credits are. Then the two education credits that we're going to talk about is the American Opportunity Credit and the Lifetime Learning Credit. Probably more focus on the American Opportunity Credit. That's the one that lends to a little bit more difficult situations here. We'll talk about 1098Ts and scholarships. We'll talk about what's the difference between a restricted grant and an unrestricted grant, and where are the times where you might run into having the claim under an income and be subject to the Kiddie tax, which, by the way, is out of scope for us. But this can become a little tricky in figuring this out here, but we're going to tell you about that. So again, just to set the stage, we won't dwell on this a lot, but what's the difference between a deduction and a credit? A deduction lowers your taxable income, the amount that you have that is subject to tax, whereas a credit actually reduces your taxes dollar for dollar. There are two types of credits. There's refundable credits, which will bring your tax liability down to zero. And if there's anything left over in the credit, then increases your refund. But then there's also non-refundable credits, which will only bring your tax liability to zero. And if there's anything left over, you lose it. So just to summarize, credits are better than deductions, and refundable credits are better than non-refundable credits. So let's discuss, this is the TaxSlayer screen, which over here is where you go into the federal section, and when you click on deductions, you get this screen right here. And here's where we're going to access the American Opportunity Credit and the Lifetime Learning Credit, generally referred to as education credits. Okay, so here's the credit screen. Many of these things are out of scope, but right here in the middle is where you're going to access education credits. And as this says, it's, education expenses usually reported on Form 1098T. Not always, but we're gonna dive into detail in that 1098T here. So here's kind of a chart that summarizes the different credits, whether they're refundable or non-refundable. Over on the left, you can see there's not many refundable. The earned income credit, which is a biggie, is completely refundable, as is the Arizona property tax credit and increased excise tax credit. You'll see most of the credits, including one of our education credits, is non-refundable, but there's a couple that are kind of partially, I call them hybrid credits, because a portion of these two are refundable and a portion is non-refundable. So we're going to kind of discuss how that works here too. So I've got a few slides here of useful statistics. I'm not going to read them all to you, but basically you can, if you're interested, we've got links down here where you can kind of look this up. But basically what we're trying to say here is that lots of families use scholarships and grants to help pay for college. And it's a pretty sizable amount, is the average one. The largest federal scholarship in terms of awards, not in terms of dollar amounts necessarily, but it's the Pell Grant. And that's really what we see a lot of in VITA sites. We're dealing more with low-income students, and those students who go to college, they almost always qualify for a Pell Grant for that. So we see a lot of that here. This is kind of a graphic that shows that 27% of families use grants and scholarships to help pay for college. Some of them borrow a lot of money. We all know about the student debt. Should we call it a crisis? I mean, other journalists and that are calling it a crisis. But you can see that a lot of the college tuition is paid by grants and scholarships too. This slide just kind of talks about the opportunity that scholarships create. And, 80% of families say that scholarships made it possible for their students to attend college. And I would say scholarships and grants. I'm one of those. I would not have been able to go to college without scholarships and grants. And I've been kind of a lifetime student, all of that. This statistic will also show you 50% do not apply because they're completely unaware or they think that their family makes too much money, which if you ever get the chance to advise them, just tell them to go fill out the FAFSA. I mean, it's a little difficult, but it can't hurt. They might qualify. Again, here we've got some documentation if you want to look at some of those studies that do it. Here's a study that was on attitudes on borrowing. 49% of families reported borrowing for college. And of those who borrowed, look, a lot of them think they're not even going to have to pay it back. Either their loans will be forgiven or, So again, a lot of these statistics come from a survey that interviewed 1,000 undergraduate students, 1,000 parents, some students from historically Black college or universities. Again, you've got a statistic here or you've got a site here where you can go kind of look at that. So now let's dive into these credits here. There's generally 2 education credits that we deal with. It's called the American Opportunity Credit, or AOTC for short, or the Lifetime Learning Credit. Now, taxpayers can take these credits either for themselves, their spouse, and or dependents that are claimed on their tax return. Okay, if they attended an eligible post-secondary educational institution during the year. That you may ask, what's an eligible post-secondary school? That's one that's accredited. And it's really easy to find out if a school's accredited or not. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. So here's a basic summary of Lifetime Learning Credit versus the American Opportunity Tax Credit. So the Lifetime Learning Tax Credit it can help pay for undergraduate, graduate, professional degree courses, any course that's used to acquire or improve job skills, and it's available for any year of your life. Now, that's an important distinction right there, because here I'll give you an example. Maybe you've got, it's quite popular, at least here in Arizona, in Maricopa County, students in high school, they can be taking courses that are eligible for dual credit. They have to pay tuition to the community college or the university, but they're in high school and that course has more rigorous things and they get college credit for that course. So now, can you use that? You could actually even use it for the American Opportunity Tax Credit, although probably not. Probably not, and it wouldn't be wise anyway, because you're kind of wasting it. But you definitely could use the Lifetime Learning Credit for those courses. Now, the American Opportunity Tax Credit, it's only available for 4 years. You can only claim it 4 times. Even though I'm a retired community college professor, and I'll tell you, a lot of these students, they're on the 6-year plan. They're going to they're going to college for 6 years. You can only use it for 4 of those years. And if you happen to, as we're going to learn later, if you graduate early, I mean, some of these students, they're getting credit in high school, they're going into college, and they're only there 3 years. If they get a bachelor's degree, they can only claim it for 3 years. There's a little bit of wiggle room in that last year, but generally that's the rule, okay? The Lifetime Learning Credit, it's 20% of eligible expenses up to a maximum of $2,000. So in other words, you could have up to $10,000 of expenses. You get 20% of those as a credit. Okay. On the other hand, the American Opportunity Tax Credit is much more generous. It covers 100% of the first 2,000. So dollar for dollar, the first 2,000 of your educational expenses, you get to take as a credit. And then you get 25% of the second 2,000. So that would be an additional $500 or a maximum of $2,500 that you can get for the American Opportunity Credit. So that's a much more generous credit that you can get there. Both the lifetime learning credit is 100% non-refundable. You've got to have a tax liability to use it, or you lose it. Don't get it. On the other hand, the American Opportunity Tax Credit, 40% of the credit is a refundable credit, meaning 1,000 of the full 2,500 you could get back even if you didn't have a tax liability. So that's an important distinction to remember, and there's some more idiosyncrasies about this in a moment we'll kind of go over. Okay. Education credits, they're based on qualified education expenses, or sometimes we call it qualified tuition and education expenses, QTRE. You'll see that abbreviation here that we'll do. These are expenses that are paid during the tax year. Now, right here it says for an overview of education, see Pub 4012 tab J. I will tell you that my publication 4012 that I take into sites, that tab J gets more wear and tear than any other part of the book. Okay, there are so many little differences between the different types of education credits, what expenses qualify it, the amounts, the things. I use that constantly, and I would encourage you to get comfortable with using that 4012. Okay, so let's talk about what are some of the disqualifying conditions. Okay, and a disqualifying condition would include a taxpayer who could be claimed as a dependent on someone else's return. Now let's stop there for a second. And this is, I said could, who could be claimed. It's not whether or not they're being claimed or not being claimed. It's would they be eligible to be claimed. It's the facts and circumstances. And if you need to, go into the 4012, and where under the dependents section, it lists all of the requirements to be claimed as a dependent. And if that student meets those requirements, they can't claim themselves. I mean, they can, but they wouldn't be eligible for these credits or not. So keep that in mind as we go through this too. If they file married filing separate in other parts of our training, especially here in Arizona, there is absolutely no advantage to doing a married filing separate return. It's not going to save you any taxes, and it will probably disqualify you for things such as, these education credits. Okay, there are AGI limits. And so quite often, you've got the students that are going to school, and we just, in this first one, we kind of determined, yeah, well, they're living away in Flagstaff going to NAU, but hey, their parents are contributing to half of their support. And yeah, even though they're not living in the house for 6 months, that's called a temporary absence. And yes, they would qualify, as that person's dependent. So now that taxpayer, sometimes the parents, they lose the credit because the AGI limit, I think for a married filing joint, it starts to phase out at 160 and phases out at $180,000. So that could be. Then the last one here says who was a non-resident alien for any part of the tax year and did not elect to be treated as a resident alien for tax purposes. This sounds kind of complicated, and it kind of is, but if say you've got an American citizen who's married to a non-resident alien, they could elect to be taxed as a resident alien. But by the way, that is out of scope for us, and we're not likely to see this. Okay, but if they were a non-resident alien for any part of the year, they're not going to qualify for these expenses. So sometimes we get a lot of foreign students that are coming here. Some of them have to file tax returns because they're working here. right? But unfortunately, we can't get them these education credits. What are some of the conditions to qualify for the credit? Well, the credit amounts are based on qualified education expenses paid during the tax year. Okay. Had to have actually paid them during the year. Okay. To claim the qualified expenses, if it's the parent, the taxpayer must be able to claim the student as a dependent. If they can't, in other words, they fail some of those tests, the student can claim themselves and they might be able to get these tax credits. But remember, the major part of it are non-refundable credits. They've got to have a tax liability to be able to get it. These expenses must be paid to an eligible educational institution, in other words, an accredited institution. It's really easy to find a list of accredited institutions, but in general, I will tell you, like here in Arizona, any of the community colleges qualify. The 3 major state universities and plus Grand Canyon University, those are all accredited institutions. It's like, you know, there might be a barber college or a beauty college that may not be accredited, those kinds of things. And if you see something that's not a little off standard, you know, go Google accredited institutions. There's a list from the Department of Education that'll tell you, you can look it up to see if they're accredited or not. Now, this last one here, we'll talk a little bit about this. It says proof of expenses, including such documents as receipts, Form 1098-T, or a tuition statement issued by the school are required. Now, first of all, before I get to the asterisk, we are not auditing these students, and it's just like charitable contributions or other things. We take them at their word. But when we say required, there's almost no way you can accurately calculate this without seeing the student's college statement, their tuition statement that's provided. And yes, oh, by the way, TaxSlayer will require a 1098-T. And actually IRS says that's required that they have it. However, they say, and this is the asterisk right down here, unless the institution is not required to send a 1098-T, which is usually if all of the expenses were covered by a grant or a scholarship. But hey, be careful. We're going to talk a lot about these grants, and we can find that there are some ways that, you know, even though the school says they received a grant and we used it to pay educational expenses, we're going to find out a little later that that may not be the case. And often, you know, I mentioned earlier that especially community college students, they're almost all eligible for Pell Grants, and the Pell Grant will cover the tuition. And that so often the Maricopa colleges or, you know, community colleges don't even issue the 1098-T. That doesn't mean we can't claim the education expenses. We have to fake TaxSlayer out, maybe put in a false employer identification number for the institution, but we're still allowed to do that. We can do that. Okay. Here's an example of a 1098-T. We're going to see a couple more of these later on, but here's box 1. It'll say payments received for qualified tuition and related expenses. Okay. Here's the first thing I'm going to tell you. Why do you need that statement of their account? Because I rarely see any of these that are accurate. For example, I'll give you, like, we're in Arizona, here in Phoenix, Arizona State University. They'll issue one of these, and this is only going to be for the tuition that's paid. However, you can't attend Arizona State University if you don't pay a rec fee and a scholarship fee, and I think there may be even 1 or 2. But those aren't included in here, but they are required to be able to enroll. We can count those as qualified educational expenses. I rarely see these 1098-Ts that are really accurate. And then we're going to see later on where they may report scholarships or grants here. Hopefully you don't see one that has adjustments made for a prior year. If you do, that's going to be out of scope for us. You might see here, box 7, it says, checked if the amount in box 1 includes an amount for an academic period beginning January to March. Actually, this would be 2025 now. Okay, if you know, we jimmied up this thing. We just didn't change this 2022. In other words, what this means is, and it's quite common, okay, the students have to choose their classes in December for the spring semester coming up, and quite often they pay for those to make sure that they can lock in their classes. And this number up here may reflect amounts that are paid for here. I think IRS wants to know this to make sure that they can go check and make sure you don't double count it, those expenses in the next year, right? And that's why they have this box here. There's other boxes on here that are important. We're going to learn in a little bit that the American Opportunity Credit means you have to be at least a half-time student. Or the Lifetime Learning or the American Opportunity Credit wouldn't apply if you were a graduate student, meaning you've already received a bachelor's degree. So these boxes are important for us. Okay. It does not matter whether or not a student paid the expenses themselves. Any expense paid on behalf of the student is considered as if the student had paid them themselves. In other words, grandma gives you a couple $1,000s to help you out with college, right? That's grandma made you a gift and you paid your own tuition with it. You see how that works? Same thing. Similarly, you may not qualify for grants or scholarships, but you qualify for loans. You borrow money that you have to pay back. That's your money. And even though you got it on a loan, is if you use that to pay tuition or other qualified expenses, then that's as if that's your money and you paid it because you're on the hook to pay it back. Okay. So keep that in mind as we go through this. Now, this is a little complicated area here. And when you get into TaxSlayer, there's going to be a section that asks you about these things. And you almost have to read this carefully. But this is saying none of the credit is refundable. Remember, I told you a portion, there's $1,000 of this that is refundable. Now, this doesn't apply. It's still, even if you fail some of these tests down here, you would still be eligible for the non-refundable portion. But you kind of read these questions here. Was the dependent under 18 or, and it may not be the dependent, you may have kind of an independent student. He's moved out of the house. I mean, I moved out at 16, that's good. But if they're under age 18 or they're age 18 at the end of the year and their earned income was less than half of their own support, meaning this is saying, look, you probably should be claimed on your parents' return, and we're not going to give you, a refundable portion of this. That's kind of what this is doing. Or you're a full-time student over 18, under 24, and their income was less than half of their own support, or they do not file a joint return. In other words, they're married and they file, a separate return. We're going to show you a little bit later in the TaxSlayer screen where these questions are. This is rare that you're going to see this. Okay, so don't get too hung up in this here. Okay, for the American Opportunity Credit only, there's differences between these two credits. Expenses for books, supplies, and equipment the student needs for a course of study are included in qualified education expenses, even if it is not paid to the school. I taught community college for 20 years, and I'll tell you, books are expensive. And these students would find ways to find them used on Amazon or other places. They'd buy them from other students, whatever. Those are qualified expenses. They didn't pay them to the school. And even when they paid them, like there'll be a school bookstore, but the school bookstore is run, they put it out to bid to third parties that run the bookstore. In box one of that 1098T, if you bought books even at the student bookstore, it's not necessarily included in that. However, and it does say books, supplies, and equipment. And especially these days, since COVID, and we had all of this online. I mean, online learning has been around since before COVID, but it was always kind of a, wishy-washy thing. Well, did you really have to buy the computer? Well, hey, there's a computer lab at school. You could go use those computers. It was kind of facts and circumstances whether you could deduct a computer for online classes. But since COVID came along and there was so much of this, IRS has acknowledged that, hey, if you're taking online classes, a computer is a legitimate expense for doing it. So, okay. So be sure when you're talking to these students that you ask them about that. Okay. So now, courses of study. For the American Opportunity Credit, they must be pursuing a degree, certificate, or other recognized educational credential. You know, in the community colleges, we have certificates. They can go and they can take, 6, 8, 10 courses, whatever, and get a certificate. For instance, we have a program for enrolled agents if they want to be tax preparers. They don't have to get an associate's degree or a bachelor's degree. They just get a certificate. That qualifies. Okay. For the lifetime learning credit, you don't have to be in a degree certificate, but the course has to be used to acquire, that's one thing, acquire new skills or improve their job skills. Okay, so I'm a CPA. If I wanted to go back to take an advanced Excel course so I can learn more about pivot tables or something, right? I could go take that course and I could get a lifetime learning credit for it. In the lifetime learning credit, you don't have to attend at least half time. But watch this one real carefully here. Qualified expenses are for tuition and registration, but not for books, supplies, and equipment unless they're paid directly to the school. And I'm not talking about the bookstore. I'm talking about the school. And now some of these classes, sometimes as part of the course fee requires a fee to like be in an online uh, site that provides books and exercises and homework, things like that. If it's required, that would count. You do not have to be pursuing a degree. This is for the lifetime learning credit. I mentioned earlier, you can take this in any year of your life. You could have a 16-year-old who's taking courses at a community college for dual enrollment, we call it. They're taking the course to satisfy their high school requirements, but it also gives them college credit, and they pay tuition. We can claim the lifetime learning credit for that. Okay, so we've already kind of showed, here's a simple situation of a 1098-T. It says, hey, you've got $650 of expenses, but I almost promise you that's not all of their expenses. You need to ask them questions. Where'd you buy your books? Did you any of these online courses? Did you have to pay any fees associated with this? Okay, so this is the simple one. So here are some of the questions you want to ask about this. Is this your first time in college to get a 4-year degree? Now they may be in community college and they might say, well, no, I'm just going for a 2-year degree. Well, that would still count. It would be okay. But then you want to say, can you be claimed as a dependent by anyone? Now, their response is going to be, oh, no, my dad doesn't claim me. Okay, well, good. He chose not to claim you, but you got to ask, is he paying more than half of your support? Did you live more than half the year with them? You got to ask those questions to see whether or not they could be claimed as a dependent by their parents. Did you have a 1098-T from your college? Oh, no, they didn't give me one. Well, now you got to say, look, okay, can you log on to your student account? Sometimes you log on to the student account and they just didn't realize what they were getting in the mail. They got it and they trashed it. They can go get a copy of it on their online account. Or, as I said earlier, maybe the school wasn't required to send them one, but then we want them to print out their record of account to see what expenses were paid, what grants and scholarships and loans and things that they got. When we have this record of account, we can sort through that. But then we want to ask them, did you have any other expenses you paid for college? And oh yeah, I had to pay for parking. Well, okay, unfortunately parking doesn't count, but hey, I did have to buy, our teacher required us to buy this online package of stuff that he had put together, and there was a fee for that, right? Okay, I had to pay for that. So that would count. You want to try to drag out of them everything. And that's going to be difficult sometimes. Okay, they're going to say, oh yeah, I bought all my books on Amazon. Okay, well, do you have receipts for that? Well, no. sometimes we got to send them away and have them go scrub through their credit cards or their checking accounts or bank accounts and come back to us and tell them what those things are. Remember, we're not auditing them, but you have a requirement to at least do some due diligence. And if they're sitting there say, oh yeah, I took 2 classes and that biology book cost me $175, right? Well, they know what they paid. I mean, we can take them at their word. But if they say, well, I don't know, man, I must have paid $350 for books, I wouldn't accept that. Okay, I mean, they're just picking a number out of an air, which may be accurate. Hey, they may be understating it, but I'm going to send them away and say, hey, you got to come back with a more definitive number. Okay. Now, here's where we start getting a little bit tricky when we get to grants and scholarships. Okay. So, and I'm going to introduce this idea. We've got something that I'll tell students and trainees and stuff when I teach these classes, that I'm going to introduce in a minute the poor man's loophole as it applies to grants and scholarships. So let's start with one thing, and let me take you back to when you were doing your original training and certification. In the 4012, there's 2 pages that say, what is income, what is not income? And I tell students, forget the what is income thing. Everything is income that makes you better off unless it is specifically excluded. Go to that second page to see what's specifically excluded. One of those things, it says, if you get scholarships or grants that are used to pay educational expenses, you don't have to pay tax on it. However, if you get those scholarships and grants and you don't use them to pay educational expenses, then you do have to pay tax on it. So I want you to think about that. So this slide is saying here, the IRS does not require you to reduce qualified expenses by any amount you pay with borrowed funds, such as loans or credit cards. We said that earlier. I can use a student loan to pay for qualified expenses and get the credit on it. However, you may not include any amount you receive from tax-free scholarships. In other words, we use those to pay for educational expenses. You can't double dip, can't use those. Federal Pell Grants, careful here, this is where our loophole is going to come in. Federal Pell Grants that are used to pay educational expenses. We're going to learn in a little bit that you don't necessarily have to use that Pell Grant to pay for educational expenses. You can use that to pay for room and board, rent or, whatever. And then you might be able to then say, I used other money to pay for my educational expenses, and that frees that up for the credit. If you get tuition grants from an employer, okay, those are tax-free, so you can't use those grants to pay to get the credit. That would be double dipping, okay? If you get refunds from the school or other non-taxable assistance that you receive, other than gifts and inheritances. Now, if you get a gift or an inheritance, that's your money and it's not taxable, and you can use that to pay for educational expenses. And yes, then you can use those expenses to get the credit. So what are qualified expenses? Those are amounts paid for tuition, fees, and other related expenses that are required for enrollment or attendance at an eligible educational institution. I gave you the example in a minute about ASU. You can't enroll unless you pay the rec fee and the scholarship fee, and I think there may be 1 or 2 others. They're not much, okay, but those are required fees. Those count. And they won't be reported in box 1 of that 1098-T either. Okay. You can claim expenses that must be paid that are for an academic period that starts during the tax year or the first 3 months of the next tax year. That's like in December, you're enrolling for the spring semester and you go ahead and pay your tuition to lock in your classes, right? So you don't get dropped out of it. You can use those expenses in the current year, even though you're attending in the subsequent, as long as it's in the first 3 months of the next year. Student activity fees you're required to pay. I just kind of gave you an example of that. And this is an example of an activity fee that you're required to pay. Those all count as qualified education expenses, okay? I'll back up here and I'll say, books and equipment required lab fees. Maybe you got to buy goggles to do your chemistry lab. Those would count. Anything that's required to be able to attend that course, required by the instructor. Okay. Expenses that do not qualify for both educational credits right here. Okay. Room and board, insurance, medical expenses, transportation, personal expenses, student fees, unless they're required as a condition of enrollment. You know, they may say, oh yeah, I had to pay the parking fee. Well, that wasn't required. You chose to pay so you could park on campus, right? You didn't have to pay that. Okay, again, the same expenses that are paid with tax-free educational assistance, you can't use those to then claim a credit. That would be double dipping. Okay. Expenses for sports, games, hobbies, or non-credit courses do not qualify. You can sign up, you can pay for a one-credit course to use the gym at a community college. Well, unfortunately, you can't take credit for that thing unless the course is part of the student's degree program. For instance, I just mentioned the gym. You know, what if you're in a physical therapy program or exercise science program and it's required that you take a weightlifting class, right? Well, that would count. But if you're just taking it for your own benefit, no, it doesn't. Okay. For the lifetime learning credit only, these expenses would qualify if the course helps the student acquire or improve job skills. So you can use these to train for a new job, that's acquiring job skills, or you're in an existing job and you want to improve those skills, you can use it for that. I mentioned earlier about 4012 Tab J education credits. Get familiar with this. As I told you, when I work at a site, by the end of the tax season, this is the pages are falling out of Tab J. Okay, I use them constantly because there are differences about what expenses qualify for each credit, how much you get for each credit, whether you have to be a full-time or a half-time student or not. You know, all of these, if you look down this column, right, it'll tell you, is it refundable or non-refundable, number of years, number of tax years the credit's available, the type of program required, number of courses. All we're going to see here about felony drug conviction. You get the idea. There's a lot of details about these credits that you're not going to remember after just listening to this 1 hour lecture here. Learn how to use that 4012 and do it. You cannot get multiple benefits for the same expenses. And in fact, I'm pretty sure you can only claim one of these credits in a year. In other words, maybe you went to a really expensive 4-year school that costs $10,000 a year and you use $4,000 for here. You can't then use the other $6,000 for lifetime learning credit. You can only take one or the other credit during the year. Okay, so here's where we get a little bit more of a complicated situation. We get a 1098-T, and now it says that, hey, you got $500 of scholarships or grants. You paid $650 in qualified education expenses, although remember, ask them, there's probably more than that, but nevertheless, we'll just kind of keep this simple. Let's say that that's their qualified expenses. Here's their scholarship or grant. So what do we deal with that? So in general, and here's how the school's going to deal with it, they're going to say you had 650 of expenses, 500 of the scholarship we're going to use to apply to those expenses so you don't have to pay taxes on it. And that leaves you can only claim $150 of qualified expenses to get the American Opportunity Credit or Lifetime Learning Credit if that was the case, right? And then TaxSlayer, there's some little boxes. You just fill these in the boxes and TaxSlayer is going to make the calculation for you. Okay. So I've said this again, but this is reduced. Qualified expenses must be reduced by the amount of tax-free educational assistance, grants and scholarships. But here's the key thing, tax-free. So if you apply those grants and scholarships to the tuition, you then can't use them to count them for the credit. However, we're going to see here in a minute, this is the loophole. Not all grants have to be, are required to be used to offset education. You may choose to pay taxes on it and then use those expenses to get the credit. So let's kind of look at that. And this all revolves around whether it's a restricted grant or an unrestricted grant. So here are some types of grant restrictions, okay? It'll say the grant restricts how the money can be spent. The grant will say this can only be used to pay your tuition. That's a restriction, okay? Or it may say this can only be used to pay for books. That's a restriction, okay? It may say, hey, this is so that you can come and play soccer at our school, but you must play soccer and be on the team to use that. Well, that's a restriction. Can't do it. Or it might say, if you don't get a GPA of 2.5, you got to repay this thing. That's a restriction. So you get the idea, right? Maybe you've got to do a little bit of work after graduation. It's a restriction. Okay. However, generally, recipients of grants are free to decide how exactly to spend the grant money, and they're not obligated to do anything in return for the grant. That's called an unrestricted grant. By default, the grant is unrestricted, although you need to ask them. But here's the simple thing. Pell Grants are unrestricted grants, and that's the majority that we see are Pell Grants. But if they get a special kind of scholarship, you got to ask them, did you have to do anything special for this? Was there requirements for it? Do you ever have to pay it back? Things like that. So here's some examples. If you get a Coverdell scholarship, that can only be used to pay for these things. So that's a restriction. But on the other hand, a Pell Grant, I could use that to pay my rent or buy clothes or pay for transportation, right? And then I can say, well, my dad gave me money to pay tuition and books. That was a gift, right? I don't have to pay taxes on it, can do it. But now if I elect to use my Pell Grant to pay for these things, I've got to pay tax on that Pell Grant. If I don't use it to offset education expenses, it now becomes taxable. Okay, so here's another not so simple situation you would get. Here, you've only got $650 of expenses, but you got $1,000 of grants. Oh, what do we do with that? Well, here's $1,000 scholarship. Here's qualified tuition and related expenses, $650. Now you've got $350 of unearned income. And this distinction here is going to be important in a minute. We're going to see here in a bit. You put in these, in TaxSlayer, there's boxes you can put this in, and it will know what to do with this. They're going to report it as other income, and that's considered unearned, so it's not going to help them with their earned income tax credit or anything like that, okay? So here's where you would enter that other income too. And I said a minute ago, TaxSlayer will take care of it. It doesn't. TaxSlayer uses that in order how to calculate the education credits. We have to enter in that extra income. And here we go into the income screen, and we actually have to go down towards the bottom. And here it says other income. And when we click on that, we get another screen that says, this is where we would put in gambling or other income. But there's a place, other compensation, income such as scholarships, grants, blah, blah, blah. Okay. So here's where we've got to enter in that extra. And here we go, scholarships and grants, not reported on a W-2, right? This came on a 1098-T, and we decided, hey, we've got more scholarship money than we've got expenses. We've got to pay tax on some of that. So we're going to go into this screen and do it. And here we put in the amount of scholarships and grants. Okay, now here's where it starts to get a little complicated. You've got a child who's at home, or remember, they can be away at college, but that's a temporary absence. We've decided that, hey, they're claimed on their parents' return. Okay. And this is usually they're under 18 or full-time students under 24. Otherwise, if they're not full-time, if they're 18 and not a full-time student, they're not their parents' dependent. They're on their own. Okay, so This is kind of general. So in 2024, the first $1,250 of a child's unearned income is tax-free, and the amount over $1,250 is taxed at the child's tax rate, with unearned income over $2,600 being taxed at the parent's tax rate. Now, you have to go back into your 4012, and there's a tab there, it's under A or B, I forget, about who must file a return. And there's another separate page that says if you're claimed as a dependent on your parent's return, you've got to look at whether you've got earned income or unearned income. This is really important for this distinction here in a second. So let's look at this slide right here and burn this one into your memory, right? It says dependent students under age 24 are required to pay kiddie tax if both of the following are true. You've got unearned income. So let's for a second, let's pretend we're going to do that poor man's loophole, and we got a 1098-T that says, okay, hey, you've got $6,000 of scholarship income and $5,000 of expenses, right? But now we want to say, hey, this was a Pell Grant, and we want to maximize their things. So what we want to do is we want to take some of that scholarship income and pay tax on it so that we can maximize that. There's $4,000 is the maximum expenses. So we're going to add this onto the child's tax return, put $4,000 on it as income. Now think about this for a second. Generally, will the child have to pay tax on that? Because now look at the second part. It says, now, before I get to the second part, this would be unearned income. And at first you're going to think, oh, wow, man, yeah, I got that 4,000. I'm in trouble here. We've got unearned income. Now we've got kiddie tax. And by the way, that's going to be out of scope. But watch what happens here. Both conditions have to be filed. It says, and the dependent student has a filing requirement. Now, careful here. This sounds not kind of inconsistent. It is inconsistent, okay? But you look at page A4 in the 4012, and it says, for purposes of the filing requirement, earned income includes salaries, wages, tips, professional fees, and taxable scholarship and fellowship grants. We've now made 4,000 of that Pell Grant taxable. Now that becomes earned income, and if you go look in those requirements of who must file a return, earned income can count up to the standard deduction, which is what, 14,600? The point is, generally, these kiddos will not have a filing requirement. If you take some of that scholarship income and choose not to, or grant income, and choose not to apply it to education expenses and cause it to be taxable on their return, they still don't even have a filing requirement. And yet now we're going to be able to use that $4,000 to get the American Opportunity Tax Credit. That right there is the poor man's tax loophole, right there. Okay, now, careful here. What if they got a job? And maybe they do have, another $6,000 or $7,000 of earned income, and we tack on $4,000 here, and they've got some other income and stuff like that. And now they do have a filing requirement. Now that scholarship income becomes unearned, and it's going to be taxed at the higher tax rate of the parents. Although I would tell you, they're probably still better off getting the credit. Go ahead and pay the tax at the parent's tax rate, okay, and get the credit. But here's the problem. We can't do the return. We got to send them to a paid preparer to do the return. So that's that, okay? Here is, again, remember, and here this gets a little wishy-washy, okay? Because I've said before, and this is the third or fourth time I'm saying it now, it's not whether you choose to claim your child as a dependent or choose to let him or her claim themselves. It's the facts and circumstances. Did you provide more than half of their support? Did they live with you for more than 6 months of the year? Were they a citizen, a resident of that? I forgot, there's two other tests that go, but they skip. It's those facts and circumstances. So if your child is full-time college student and you can claim them as a dependent until they're 24, even if they are away from home, which is classified as a temporary absence, or if they're working while in school, you must still provide more than half of their financial support to claim them. This may be a way where, okay, here's the problem. Maybe you've got the parents whose income is too high, they're not going to get any of the credit. Maybe you want the student to be able to claim themselves. Now, if they're working and they work enough to say, well, okay, I paid my own rent and my own groceries. Oh yeah, dad gave me some money, but that was a gift that I used to pay for college or other things, right? You know, you can justify allowing the student to claim themselves. You might get them to be able to fail that support test, right? So be careful. And even if you can claim them as a dependent, they may still have to file a tax return, okay? So let's look at some of those situations, right? Even if they meet any of the requirements below, they're going to have to file their own tax return. You know, they've got earned income of more than 14,600. They've got unearned income of more than 2,600. Unearned meaning interest, dividends, or capital. Now, careful, remember that inconsistency about for determining if you have to file a return. The tax-free scholarships are considered earned income. So it would get up to this thing. But then once you have to file a return, it really becomes unearned income. Wow, I know, that's confusing. And if they're married, they usually are required to file a return if their income is more than 29,200. That's the standard deduction for married. However, if they file a return just to get their refunds back, then that's not going to cause any problem, right? Okay. So I've kind of said this already. If your college student is your dependent, meaning you've provided more than half their support and they meet the other test, you get to take the tax credits, okay? However, there's income thresholds. I've already talked about that. They start phasing out. If you're single, they start phasing out at 80,000 and they're gone by 90,000 of adjusted gross income. If you're married, the phase out starts at 160 and it ends at 180. Above 180, you're not getting any of the credit whatsoever. If you can get the student to fail one of those support tests, they can claim their own return. Now, careful here. Remember, you know, of that $2,500 credit, 1,500 of it is non-refundable. So usually that student's not going to probably have a big tax liability when they've got a $14,600 standard deduction. But they could still maybe get the $1,000 refundable portion, right? That's better than losing it all, you know, if you can work it out. The 4012 has a worksheet in there that allows you to determine who provided more than half of their support. It's going to ask you about, well, how much is the rent, how much did they pay, how much is the food, how much is the clothing, blah, blah, blah. So you could use that worksheet to maybe determine this. Okay, so let's look at, there's a couple of little slides here that I want to kind of show you about that. If they're between 18 and 24, are they eligible for the refundable portion? So if we go in here to credits, we're going to go in here to education credits. This is in TaxSlayer, right? We'll select which student, you know, this is determined by the dependents, right? So you'll select a student. Now it's going to ask you these questions here to determine if you qualify. Okay, did you receive a 1098-T? You almost always have to answer yes, okay? And it said, did the student receive a 1098-T with box 7 checked? If you remember, I said that box 7 was, hey, are some of these expenses used to pay for the first 3 months of next year, right? Just go by what the form says and check these boxes, right? You put in the institution names required, the countries required, address, zip code. Look down here, employer identification is required. Now, we've said that sometimes the institution doesn't even have to file these things. So, but you're not going to be able to claim these credits in TaxSlayer unless you put this in. Now, for major institutions, you can fake this out. You can pretend that they got a 1098-T because you're looking at their student statement, right? You know how much expenses that they pay, tuition and stuff. You know what scholarships and things they got. You don't necessarily know the EIN, but I'm telling you, it's easy to find that. And even if you couldn't, you could probably fake one out here. It's not like the return's going to reject if it doesn't match. It's not like a W-2, right? But we're going to have to still fill this out. And then now from the 1098-T, you look at tuition paid, you look at grants and scholarships. That was down there in box 4. Other qualified expenses. We're asking them, hey, did you buy your books at Amazon? Did you buy a computer? Did you, those things, we're going to put that in here. And then there's some more questions about the American Opportunity Tax Credit. Has this been claimed? And it used to be called the Hope Credit, but that's many years ago. It's kind of going away. Have you already claimed it on 4 prior tax returns? You only get to claim it 4 times. So you got to say no here, or otherwise it's going to shift. TaxSlayer is going to know that, okay, well, they can't get the AOTC, but maybe they can get the lifetime learning credit. Were they enrolled at least half time for at least 1 academic period, beginning in, this would be 2024. Yeah. Hold on 1 second and I will come back here. Okay, so we were talking about this screen here, the American Opportunity Tax Credit. And we had left off here, I had to stop for a second, but it said, was the student enrolled for at least half time? And this actually would be 2024 or the first 3 months of 2025 if paid in 2024. And here's this, let's define what does half-time mean. First of all, in general, if they're on a semester system, it just means that they're enrolled for 2 classes or 6 credit hours in at least one of the semesters of school. Now, the easiest thing for you to do is look at that 1098-T, and remember I showed you down at the bottom, there's a box there that says, were they enrolled at least half time? So that box needs to be checked, okay? And then it'll say here, did the student complete the first 4 years of higher education? This is kind of a bad phrase here. It should say, did they complete a bachelor's degree before 2023? Because as I said, they may be on the 6-year plan. It may take them 6 years to complete a bachelor's degree. They can only use the American Opportunity Tax Credit 4 times, but if they complete a bachelor's degree, like say within 3 years, that's really what this is asking for, okay? And then there's more questions down below. It said, did you have a felony drug conviction before the end of, this should be 2024, okay? Now, this almost seems like a stupid question, but I guess some legislator had to put this in here, but hopefully we're gonna say no. Okay, now, right here, this is that complicated area that I warned you about. Are you eligible for the refundable portion of the American Opportunity Credit? And you've got to read this carefully and pay attention to the and or ors. It says answer no, and we really want it to be no. I'm sorry. We see, that's what I say, you got to be careful here. We really want this to be able to answer this yes, that they are eligible for the refundable portion. But look at this carefully. It says answer no if 1, 2, and 3 apply to you. Okay, so but now 1 has some subsets that have ors in it. Were you under age 18 at the end of the year, or on age 18 and your earned income was less than half of your support, or full-time student 18 to 24 and your income was less. So if one of these apply, then okay, 1 counts. But then now 1, 2, and 3 have to count. At least one of your parents was alive at the end of the year and you're not filing a joint return. So really, we want this to be yes, but think about the big picture here. Even if it's no, perhaps it's a parent trying to claim, you know, this for somebody. this is only going to stop the refundable portion. So even if you had to answer no to this, you would, and if it's a parent and you've got enough tax liability, you would still get the credit. This is not likely to happen, okay? If you really read through this really carefully, it's not likely to hear that you're going to have to answer no to this question. Okay, once you finish it, and actually sometime it may come up and say, hey, you're not entitled to any credit, or look at the next screen, it's gone and calculated. Well, yeah, you could claim the lifetime learning credit, or you could claim the American Opportunity Credit, and this little check mark, it's going to say this is recommended. You're going to just click on one of these things. You may want to decide to take the lifetime learning credit. Maybe you've got this student who's just taken a couple of courses at a community college. They're going to transfer to Stanford and be paying a lot of tuition for several years, right? And you may want to save that American Opportunity Tax Credit for that. But you know, that needs to be a conversation. You need to let the taxpayer make this decision for this. Okay, so here's some little practices that we're going to go over here too. So Bruce and Tony are married. They file a joint tax return. For the current tax year, their AGI is 65.5. Tony's attending the local community college part-time to earn credits towards an associate degree in nursing. Tony already has a bachelor's degree in history and wants to become a nurse. She paid $2,500 in tuition and fees. Their son Ben is a full-time freshman at the state university. Bruce and Tony paid $8,000 in tuition and fees for Ben. Which credit is Tony eligible for on her tuition and fees? So pause this right now and open up your 4012 and look in tab J and try to figure out. Now we put a lot of other information in here, but the question is asking which credit is Tony eligible for. Put it on pause, go look it up, and then restart this. And we find out that the lifetime learning credit is allowed for students who take part-time courses to improve their job skills. So Tony, if I go back up here, Tony, hey, she already has a bachelor's degree. That right there should have told you that there's no American Opportunity Tax Credit for it here. But she is using this to acquire new job skills. So we would be able to say that she paid tuition, 25 in tuition and fees. Now remember, she maybe had to buy some books or pay for, she's in a nursing program, maybe she had to buy a stethoscope and scrubs. But now for the lifetime learning credit, if she wants to count those expenses, they had to be paid to the institution. So here's where we're really going to use, you know, what's in box 1, or use their statement. Maybe they did buy them, you know, pay the institution for it. So Ben really has nothing to do with any of this. Okay. So let's try another one. Mary and John file a joint tax return. Their dependent Andy was enrolled full-time in college in 2019 and dropped out of college in 2020. Wow, okay. Mary and John obtained a personal loan in 2021, and they used the proceeds to pay for tuition and related fees when Andy went back to college in 2021. Then the loan got repaid in 2024. Which year are they entitled to claim an education credit? So put this on pause, put your thinking caps on, think about, try to really sort out all of these facts and figure out which year will they be entitled to claim the education credit. And the answer is taxpayers who paid qualified tuition and related expenses with loan proceeds are still eligible to claim the American Opportunity Credit and Lifetime Learning Credit. But you calculate the credit for the year in which the taxpayer paid the expenses, not the year in which the loan was repaid. So the answer is 2021. Okay, so here's another one. Oh, this one here, you got to almost get the calculator out here. Okay, Mark paid $3,900 for his son's tuition last year. What's the maximum potential amount of his American Opportunity Credit? Okay, you may want to go back, put this on pause, go back into tab J and look at, you know, how much counts for which portion of expenses. And the answer is 2,475, because the credit is 100% of the first 2,000 and then 25% of the second 1,900. So that's why he didn't quite get up to 2,500, because he would have had to have $4,000 of expenses. Okay. Lifetime learning credit is different from the American Opportunity Credit. However, they do share some of the same requirements. Which of the following requirements is true for both education credits? Okay, A, no limit to the number of years the credits can be claimed. B, expenses related to non-credit courses are allowed as qualified education expenses. C, the credit is available for only the first 4 years of the post-secondary education. And D, to be eligible for either of the education credits, taxpayers must use any filing status other than married filing separate. And the answer is D, taxpayers who use the filing status of married filing separate are not eligible to claim either of the credits. So we went back here, what's true for both of them? So if we pick this apart, right, there's no limit to the number of years credits. Well, no, that's true for the lifetime learning credit, but it's not true for the American Opportunity Credit. Expenses related to non-credit courses are allowed as qualified education expenses. That could be true for the lifetime learning credit if it's used to expand your acquire or improve your job skills, right? But it's not allowable for the American Opportunity Credit. Credit is available for only the first 4 years. Well, that's true of the American Opportunity Credit, but not the Lifetime Learning Credit. To be eligible for either the education, taxpayers must use any filing status other than married filing separate. And that one is true for both credits. Okay, so now we're pretty much through with this thing, but I'm going to put down into the YouTube, into the description of it, I'm going to put links to where you can actually, we've got some practice returns that you can use using Practice Lab. And here's how you get into Practice Lab. So for that, we're pretty much done with this education credits video. As I said, I'll put a link to a folder to where you could actually get some practice things in. And so we hope you'll return. Our next specialized session is going to be over ITINs and what to do if you can't pay for the return, and gambling expenses. That'll be our next session. So hope to see you then. Bye-bye now.